Hello, everyone. I would like to continue where we left off last time, which means we are going to. Well, I think there's actually going to be three parts to this. We're going to have our second installation about poetry, right? It might seem like a bit much to talk about poetry, but this you can think of this today. I'm going to try to hope how that might be to contrastive. It might help you to understand. Maybe if you're, if you're just going to write fiction in prose, of course, prose is just, I would say, let's say normal writing that doesn't obey the rules of poetry. It can kind of help to sort of think about how it's different from writing verse or writing poetry. So that's one thing to keep in mind, even if you don't want to write poetry. And what I try to say is it's, in a sense, almost a good sign if you don't want to write poetry, because it's a little bit of a strange thing to do. It might help you to sort of think about or sort of understand where you are. Why are you writing fiction? And because it's the relationship. There is sort of a relationship between sort of prose and poetry, and that kind of changes over time, and you're involved in that in one way or another. This, it's sort of a question. Where is poetry in the landscape? And that's what I tried to sort of talk about last week. Was this what we might call the question of relevance? Relevance is sort of an answer to the question why. What does this really have to do with the world we live in and my experience in the world, or people's experience in the world we live in, right? And what I tried to show is that, and the justification for looking at older poetry is that it used to be more relevant. It used to would occupy a very similar position that, it might be a little bit of an exaggeration to say that it occupied the position that, let's say, Hollywood movies do, but it had I would say, a wider impact on culture. It occupied a bigger place. So that is why we really wanted to look at what it sort of was meant to achieve, the effects it created, and if you remember, we went back farther than we did when we looked at, let's say, the novel or fiction writing. Fiction writing, if you remember, I was very open about my personal prejudice, right? Because this class this is a lot about personal prejudice. In which I said that I really am of the opinion that in the 19th century, that is when, let's say, the novel becomes as powerful. That is when we could say the novel really comes into its own. It becomes just it sort of becomes just this impressive machine, like that can be sort of a theater for exposing the complexity of the individual in society, right? So we could say that in the 19th century, the novel really becomes relevant, right? Whereas it's an open question. What about the relevance of poetry, right? But I tried to talk about this idea of T.S. Eliot's, about this idea of Shakespeare being at the center of the canon. So we were talking about 16th, 17th century poetry, and how poetry was had a very significant impact on a lot of people at that time. So we can think of prose and poetry having a sort of they exist in relationship one to each other. And there's there's often one way to ask yourself a question is, well, when is which form more relevant, right? And there's another document that you will find included with a few references, and if you look at that document, you might want to open it, you might want to stop this video and keep that document open. One of the references you will see will be a Russian literary critic who wrote in the 20s and the 30s, not the 1920s and the 1930s. His name is Mikhail Bakhtin. And Mikhail Bakhtin, he wrote he wrote a few critical works, but one of them was called Aesthetics and Theory of the Novel, right? And in that book, he says something that I'm going to repeat at least half of it. I think it'll help you to ask yourself questions about, how relevant poetry or novel writing might be today. And that is Bakhtin. He wrote, one of the first books he wrote was a book on Rabelais. So he's writing about 16th century French prose, right? And he wrote a few significant essays talking about poetry from the 17th century. And in his Esthétique et Théorie du Roman, I'm saying it in French because you're probably only going to be able to find the French translation. He goes on to say that in the 19th century, that is sort of the advent of the domination of the novel, and he claims that poetry loses relevance. And he explains this in terms of voice. So I'll give his general theory, and then you can do with it, what you like. So according to, and Bakhtin so he was Russian, right? And he's writing the 20s and the 30s, and the 1920s and the 1930s. And notice it's very difficult to know to what extent he's considered to be a Marxist critic. It's difficult to know to what extent he espoused sort of Marxist ideology. But at any rate, he talks about a thing that he calls dialogism. And he says that a narrator, and this is something we talked briefly about before, but I'd like to just remind you about this in this context. He says that a narrator in a novel has sort of a composite voice. There, something called a free and direct discourse, right? In which the narrator might be relating the speech of other people, right? And usually, let's say if we were to have what we call direct reported speech, the line between the narrator's voice and the person whose voice he is transcribing is very sharp. So an example of this might be, he said, "Let's go." So if I say he said, that is clearly the voice of the narrator. But when we say "let's go," right, which is the reported speech, it is very clearly these are the very words of the person, of another speaker, right? So there's a very clean line there. Now sometimes in indirect reported speech, right, that line becomes a little bit blurry, right? And Bakhtin was a sort of a linguist and a literary critic, and he was very attentive to, I would say, the style of a writer and where in certain writers, and he actually quoted someone who we've talked about. He quoted Flaubert a lot, and in the writer he actually wrote another book on Dostoevsky, right? And so Dostoevsky and Flaubert, he says, to have this thing where the narrator, it is extremely difficult to know. To distinguish, and indeed impossible, and that is actually part of the strength of these writers. There is this fundamental ambiguity in our ability to determine who is speaking, right? And Bakhtin, as a Marxist literary critic, he claims that has something to do with the fact that I would say the porousness, right, the porosity of the narrator's voice makes the voice the sort of, in a sense, the theater for social struggle, or even the class struggle, right? So the novel treats social issues, and we have people from lower social classes and people from, let's say, I would say bourgeois characters. It's very difficult to, instead of, let's say, the novelist being clearly from a social class, the fact that there are undertones to the way the novelist writes sort of means that within the voice of the narrator there is sort of a class struggle going on, right? Which we can say makes the novel very relevant, because we can think of, notice Bakhtin is talking about the 19th century. This is a very convincing argument to why because that 19th century is very relevant, because the major thing going on in the 19th century is this class struggle, right? So that makes the novel sort of the supreme vehicle for enacting all the contradictions having to do with class, right? Which is sort of the big topic of the 19th century novel, right? And the narrator's voice reflects this, right? And we could say the narrator's voice actually enacts this, right? So that's Bakhtin, and so in talking about, you know, fiction, he opposes it to poetry, and so he says that the voice of a narrator, you know, is extremely porous. It sort of blends with everyone else's voice. You know, a real successful work of fiction, such as one where, even though this might not be exactly true, I mean, as far as Flaubert or Dostoevsky, but let's say with Dostoevsky, there's this idea that the narrator's voice kind of blends with, or is open to the influx of other voices from other social classes. That might be sort of what becomes in the 19th century the real force of the narrative voice, right, in prose and fiction. He says in poetry, it's different, because usually we measure the success of a poet in the ability of the poet to have a unique voice, right? And we've talked about this before. We've talked about the fact that you know, the 6 great Romantic poets that we mentioned, I say the great, you know, English Romantic poets we mentioned, you know, whether it be, you know, Wordsworth or Coleridge or Blake or Keats or Shelley or Byron, very often we get the feeling that in their voice, they don't really have a unique voice, right? I talked about the fact that, especially I would say with Wordsworth and Shelley, that would probably, you can hear a lot of Miltonic undertones. So we get the feeling that Milton has sort of created his own voice, right? And we've said that there might be said to be problems with that. It depends on how much you agree with T.S. Eliot or not. But the Romantic writers really, they lack their originality, because they adopt a lot of the poetic strategies of of Milton, right? And because of this, that is one way to claim, to criticize their greatness, to say, well, they haven't really forged their own unique voice, right? So this goes to say that very often people will measure a poet's greatness on the uniqueness of his or her voice, right? Whereas when we have, let's say, writing in fiction, according to someone like Bakhtin, right, the greatness, if you will, of an author's voice, or we could say a narrator's voice in this case, will be measured by his or her ability to sort of incorporate other voices, right? So it has a little bit to do with the reflection of an individual. So you might want to think of that when you're writing your stories, okay? So coming back more specifically to poetry then, so that is sort of a counter argument to poetry. It might be to argue that in this 19th century, poetry loses relevance, right? And this is, I must admit, especially true of English poetry. For example, in French poetry, you do have, you know, the symbolist poets, and we have people like Baudelaire writing about, you know, it's a more of a realist aesthetic. You know, when we have, you know, I can think of like La Muse Vénale or La Muse Malade, or when we have these sort of the poet is wandering around the Parisian suburbs and coming across, you know, I would say not very frequentable characters, right? So that is a dimension that is present in French poetry more than it must be admitted, in English poetry, and that makes English poetry seem we're a little bit more stuck in I would say a male very often. We've noticed the exceptions. We've had Rossetti, thank goodness, and we've had such poets as Emily Dickinson, but we're very often in sort of an elite male club, right? We and this is the feeling we might get when we read Tennyson, who was the poet laureate of the Victorian times. It's interesting to note that later on James Joyce will sort of make fun of Tennyson in Ulysses, calling him instead of calling him Alfred Lord Tennyson, he calls him a character in Ulysses. Stephen Dedalus thinks of him as Alfred Lawn Tennyson, as if Alfred Tennyson is continuously playing a sort of a cricket match or a tennis match. Or there is, and a lot of these poets also, of course, they came out of the same schools. It's I studied, for example, these are going to be referenced. There's going to be poets referred to, someone like Gerard Manley Hopkins or Swinburne, two other Victorian poets. I just remind you that Tennyson went to Cambridge. Someone like Gerard Manley Hopkins and Swinburne, they both went to Oxford, right? They were taught by the same people who taught Oscar Wilde, for example, right? So Oxford is a little bit of we get the feeling like we're stuck in this little clubby atmosphere, and which means that we're a little bit far from, I would say, sort of social realities, right? So that is, I think, is a real difficulty with, especially what I would say, English 19th century poetry. And thank goodness we have, I would say, and it is notable that, at least in English poetry, I would say, Christina Rossetti and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, right, which are listed in that document that you received last week. These two women poets with poems such as Goblin Market are a little bit closer to social realities, and it's refreshing. And there's a sort of I would say, a more healthy, gutsy sensuality. So it might be worth reading these poets if you want to, if you're looking for these kind of things, right? So that this will lead us up to this sort of what is referred to as the modernist period. And the modernist period, I think it's really worth looking at that, because that is where it honestly seems to me that all of these sort of difficulties that we're talking about sort of came to a head. And there a lot of answers to these questions were kind of asked. For example, and we talked once again about T.S. Eliot as a critic. Now, if we look at T.S. Eliot as a poet, and I'm glad that a lot of you have read The Wasteland. We referred to this poet before. In The Wasteland, there's a lot of, it's interesting to note, there's a lot of dialogue, right? And this is sort of an adaptation of the poet Browning, who's a 19th century poet. What is referred as a dramatic monologue. So there's this question of voice is a little bit more relevant. There's a lot of, for example, in The Wasteland, there's a lot of there's little snippets from jazz songs. Oh, that Shakespearean rag. That's a quotation from a jazz song. There's a lot of people have studied the influence of, let's say, jazz, and there's also, for example, there's Baudelaire. Last week I quoted Hypocrite lecteur mon semblable mon frère. So there is a lot. There is an influx of, I would say, we could sort of say, the underworld. One of the characters in The Wasteland is going to be is a secretary, and there is a scene in which she is awaiting. It's a body. It's a sort of a. Well, how could we describe it? It's not really we couldn't really call it a love scene, but she receives a lover in her grubby apartment. And it also should be noticed that T.S. Eliot, unfortunately, he's very moralistic about this kind of. He sees this as sort of a symbol of decline, right? So he's not very celebratory of this we could say, this encounter. So we do get the feeling that, the more social classes are present in poetry. And we also do get the feeling, and the language really reflects this. There's a lot of, we're not really caught in sort of, I would say, sort of sleepy rhyme schemes. If you remember, T.S. Eliot, in his criticism, he was he was critical. He changed his mind later on, by the way, but towards the beginning of his criticism, he was very critical of Milton because of his sort of lulling, sort of his hypnotic rhythms. And we noticed that in The Wasteland and other poems, we kind of break out. There's a lot of rupture, right? There's a lot of, and this is something that, by the way, this is a technique that T.S. Eliot adapted from French symbolic poetry. There's a lot of two-line ruptures. That's something he specifically adapted from French poetry, symbolic poetry. So, symbolist poetry. I'm sorry. So there is this feeling that there's something more jarring. We're a little bit woken up, right? We're not really kind of lulled to sleep by sort of melodious lullabies, right? We're kind of woken up, we're kind of stirred, we're meant to be shaken up by this stuff, right? And we're meant to ask ourselves questions about, what's going on in society, what is this, so it can really be thought of as a wake-up call in a lot of ways. And a lot of the poetics have really remained, the writing style. I think for all the good and bad you can say of it, a lot of the writing from this period really does seem to remain relevant in a lot of ways. So that you might want to I would say it's worthwhile reading a lot of these poets. So maybe I'll just go to very quickly talk about give you a sort of a overview of who they are and what you might want to read. And I notice we've talked about T.S. Eliot. Another thing to account for is is the fact that we are we have this. What's kind of refreshing is we're out of this English clubby atmosphere here. We have an American poet that arrives on the scene. He actually moves to London. It's interesting he is actually found in, T.S. Eliot went to Harvard. I mean, this is just to give you an idea of the sort of sociological dimension here. T.S. Eliot went to Harvard. There was a visiting professor who was Bertrand Russell, who was English. And by the way, if you have time and you want to read an excellent account of Western philosophy, the Bertrand Russell's history of Western philosophy is brilliant. But anyway, Bertrand Russell bumps into T.S. Eliot on the street, in London, and so there is this sort of a mixture between American and English culture, and so we have something a little bit refreshing coming from the United States in the UK. And we also have this. There's the Irish. I've talked about James Joyce, right? Who is an Irish writer. We also have, as far as poetry is, of course, James Joyce. He did write some poetry, but he's not at all most when he was known for that. Even though the line between prose and poetry becomes really difficult to distinguish in later works of Joyce, such as Finnegan's Wake. But if we're talking about a poet, you might want to look into someone called William Butler Yeats, who is it's a little bit difficult to place him. I would say he in many respects can be considered, especially as a younger poet, sort of almost like a late Victorian or an Edwardian poet, right? King Edward VII being king. The Edwardian period, once again, is from 1901 to 1914. So this is when Yeats, by the way, writes up into the 40s. But as a young poet, he could be a lot. On the one hand, you might think of him as he's a very lyrical poet, but I find him to be, we talk about being musical. He has a good ear. He writes, that's why I included Down by the Sally Gardens on the list there. The Lake of Innisfree. These are poets that he wrote when he was young. If you want to be kind of blown away by the music of poetry, you could do a lot worse than read William Butler Yeats. So he also is involved in a lot of this sort of Irish mythology. He has a mystical side, and it has been said, and I'm quoting an excellent biographer of a lot of Irish writers from this period, the American critic Richard Ellman. He compares James Joyce, the two Irish writers, modernist writers, James Joyce and Yeats. He says Joyce was more of a writer about cities, about sort of middle class people in cities, and Yeats was more about a writer about sort of writers. Well, it was more about the country, with a sort of this old school dynamic between sort of gentlemen and peasants, right? And so that he has a sort of old Irish mystique. So in that respect, he really seems to be anti-modern, and yet he embraced a lot of the more modernist sort of aesthetic. But at the same time, he remains extremely lyrical and a big part of the Romantic tradition. It's full of paradoxes, right? So I would say it's an interesting solution for the fact that if you just like I would say the music of poetry, that lyrical element is there. It's just as lyrical as any Romantic poetry you might hear. But I would say, at the same time, kind of put into a pressure cooker, you might want to read William Butler Yeats. There's another poet I put in there called Ezra Pound. Now, Ezra Pound actually it's interesting. He's sort of a link between Yeats and Eliot. We can say that Ezra Pound, first of all, he was American he studied in Philadelphia. He was a very paradoxical figure. He's going to be the last poet we're going to talk about here. We're going to next week I'll give you another installment. But so Ezra Pound studies languages, and he